from the shadow of the terrible pandemic that threw the world into crisis, a life-confirming anti-racist uprising simultaneously erupted. Many have stood up against blatant anti-Asian racism reactivated by the COVID-19 pandemic. The Black Lives Matter movement put a spotlight on the many deaths and acts of violence towards Black, Indigenous, and other racialized individuals at the hands of police. And just weeks before the pandemic was declared, activists around Canada mobilized in support of the sovereign Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, challenging the imposition of a pipeline through their territory.
In British Columbia, the daily experiences of racism faced by Black, Indigenous, and racialized newcomers run deep, dating back to the very inception of this province. Yet, as deep as the roots of racism run, so too do the historical roots of unfaltering resistance to racism and colonial occupation on these Indigenous lands.
The territories of the Pacific Northwest that lie north of the 49th parallel, commonly known today as British Columbia, remain unceded Indigenous lands, belonging to the nations that have lived on the northwest coast of Turtle Island since time immemorial. It wasn't until the 1840s that British settler colonialism began to seriously take hold on these lands. In 1846, the British and the US signed the Treaty of Oregon to separate their jurisdiction of the Pacific Northwest by creating a border at the 49th parallel. The late Dave Eliot, a Wasanic elder, knew well that the dispossession of his people began when the British claimed sovereignty over Wasanic territory.
It was 1846 when they divided up the country and made the United States and Canada. We lost our land and our fishing grounds. It very nearly destroyed us. All of a sudden, we became poor people. Our people were rich once because we had everything. We had all those runs of salmon and that beautiful way of fishing. When they divided up the country, we lost most of our territory.
Eliot spent his life fighting for the land of his people and to teach young people the Wasanic language, Senchothan. The Treaty of Oregon was based on the racist and now discredited doctrine of discovery, which suggested that if Europeans went any place in the world inhabited by non-whites or non-Christians, they had a right to claim that territory as their own. Consequently, zero consultation with Indigenous peoples on the facts of the Oregon Treaty ever took place, even though negotiations occurred at a time when the British population consisted of only a few hundred, mainly employees of the Hudson's Bay Company, whereas the Indigenous population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Thus, to say this land was discovered by the British is truly ridiculous. Yet, incredibly to this day, Canadian courts still rely on it as the legal basis to settler sovereignty over Indigenous territories.
In continuing to rely on this treaty, are Canadian courts not continuing the erasure of Indigenous people and reproducing this racist colonial legacy in the present day?
In the years leading up to when the colony of British Columbia joined the Canadian Federation, white British settlers made up only a fraction of a diverse early population. While Indigenous peoples made up the majority by far, newcomers from several corners of the world sought to make this land their home. Indigenous Hawaiians were among the earliest newcomers to these lands, most arriving to work for the Hudson's Bay Company. Many chose to stay in the Pacific Northwest and raise families. Chinese migrants arrived in large numbers to the Pacific Northwest for the 1858 gold rush, from California and from southern China. While present-day Vancouver has the largest Chinatown in Canada, Victoria's Chinatown is the oldest. It emerged as an entry point for Chinese gold miners and the 15,000 Chinese laborers for the Canadian Pacific Railway. However, the Chinese community soon faced inexhaustible racism from whites. In 1864, Li Chong, a prominent Chinese merchant in Victoria, demanded equal treatment for the Chinese community in a petition to Vancouver Island's governor, Arthur Kennedy. Nearly 800 black people, primarily from the southwestern states of the US, came to the colony of Vancouver Island in 1858 after receiving an invitation from the governor of BC, James Douglas. Despite establishing a strong, vibrant social and business community based in Victoria and surrounding areas, they faced racism in their daily lives, including white resistance to their joining the Victoria Volunteer Fire Department. Many prospered and contributed, like Emily Stark, who became the first black teacher on Vancouver Island. But everyday racism took its toll, and while many persevered, many chose to return to the US. Manzo Nagano, the first person to immigrate to BC from Japan, arrived in 1877. By 1911, the great majority of the 10,000 Japanese living in Canada chose to settle along the coast of BC. Thousands of newcomers from South Asia also began arriving at the turn of the 20th century. By 1908, 5,000 South Asians had settled in BC, most of whom were Sikh. The colony of BC's early population was rich in diversity. Racialized newcomers formed notable communities, raised families, pursued a wide variety of professions, established successful businesses, and made exceptional contributions to British Columbia's early social, economic, and political life. In 1871, BC and Ottawa signed the Terms of Union, an agreement that made this British colony a province like no other. This province's origins as a separate British colony dominated by a white male minority led to the imposition of the Pacific politics of white supremacy that would have severe implications for Indigenous peoples and racialized newcomers. Concerning Indigenous peoples, British Columbia's union with Canada gave the federal government legal authority on many fronts, including banning the potlatch and other Indigenous ceremonies and administering residential schools. Indigenous peoples were forced off their lands and onto reservations, were regulated out of the fisheries, and prevented from hunting on their own territories. Unlike other provinces, British Columbia maintained veto power on issues related to Indigenous peoples who lived within its borders. This veto resulted in even further disastrous policies towards BC's Indigenous populations, including a refusal to have the courts adjudicate or even discuss the question of Aboriginal land title, even though the federal government was willing to do so. Denial of the responsibility to negotiate treaties of any sort with Indigenous nations. An allocation of tiny reserves, the smallest in all of Canada. As a result, to this day, 90% of the 204 First Nations in BC still remain without any treaty. In 1872, a year after entering Confederation, BC disenfranchised Indigenous peoples and Chinese Canadians. Ever since BC's union with Canada, Indigenous leaders have fought to assert their land rights. In 1911, Haida activist Peter Kelly and nearly 100 chiefs presented a statement to Premier Richard McBride, questioning the province's unlawful assertion of sovereignty over their lands.
Honorable Sir, we come before you today as the chiefs and representatives of nearly all the Indian tribes throughout the province of British Columbia. We do not come to you as a body of settlers, but as the original inhabitants of this land. Our ancestors have occupied this country from time immemorial, and we, their children, claim that the Indian tribes still hold Aboriginal title to the unsurrendered land of the province, which has never been extinguished either by conquest or treaty. Now, if treaty has been made with the Indians in all the other provinces of the Dominion, why have the Indians in this province been ignored? We certainly think there is a very great issue and are here to ask that the matter be submitted to the courts, from which we hope to get justice.
The government refused for their case to be heard in the courts. 5 years later, the Allied Tribes of British Columbia was formed in response to the BC government's decision to significantly reduce First Nations land reserves yet again. Peter Kelly and Andrew Paul from the Squamish First Nation again petitioned the Canadian Parliament in 1926 for a formal inquiry into Indigenous land claims. This time, the government responded by passing new legislation that made it illegal for any First Nations person to bring to court any cases concerning Aboriginal title, a ban that lasted for over 2 decades. 150 years later, the struggle for Indigenous sovereignty continues. In January 2019 and again in 2020, the BC government ordered the RCMP to invade Wet'suwet'en territory to force Indigenous land defenders to allow the construction of a pipeline through their unsurrendered traditional territories, and to violently arrest those who resisted.
Wet'suwet'en.
Leaders and their allies responded by organizing sit-ins and blockades of bridges, highways, and rail lines across Canada. Ever since it became clear that white settlers were not interested in sharing the land or respecting inherent sovereignty, Indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest have boldly resisted colonial occupation. But BC's signing onto the terms of union with Canada meant that even more serious challenges were to come over the next century.
And for racialized peoples arriving to these lands, BC's union with Canada would create new racist barriers that meant that they too would be forced to mobilize to fight for justice for the next 150 years and beyond.
Oh, no,